topic is I'll be discussing about financing and de-risking mechanisms for India's energy sector, particularly in the context of Indian banking sector. So, India in August this year had communicated to UNFCCC the updated NDC, a nationally determined contribution, wherein 50%, it is envisaged that 50% of cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel sources with the help of transfer of technology and low-cost international finance. Then the Central Electrical Authority had modeled this scenario. By 2030, we would require around 420 gigawatts of non-renewable source of energy, non-fossil fuel source of energy, which includes 280 gigawatts of solar and 140 gigawatts of wind. Now, the National Investment Infrastructure Fund had put a number for cost of India's energy transition, which is about 560 billion for RE goals by 2030. And as per NIF, India will require billions of dollars of investment to achieve this target. So, to mobilize, it is important to mobilize domestic as well as international finance to fill this gap. Considering India as a developing economy, we also face some challenges like risk associated with financial as well as political risk. Financial risk like interest rate or currency risk. So for that we need to secure low cost international finance plus transfer of technology. So these are just the non-exhaustive list of sources of climate finance. You can source it from public finance through national governments, local governments, state-owned banks, NBFCs. Then there are DFIs, MDBs, bilateral and national development banks. Then there are private finance source from intermediaries, institutional investors and utilities. And there are other sources of finance from international initiatives like International Solar Alliance, CDRI, and UNFCCC mechanisms like Green Climate Fund and Clean Technology Fund. So now we in Climate Risk Horizons, basically we are a new organization, just 2 years old, and this year in March we had basically we work in assessing or analyzing the financial risks associated with climate change towards financial institutions and particularly Indian economy. So in March this year we had published a first of its kind report wherein one out of 10 criteria we assessed on green lending based on publicly available information or disclosure from banks through multiple reports and all. So we found that 32% of banks provide lending towards green financing in terms of green loans or sustainability linked bonds, etc. So 32% were providing those, but also have disclosed the investment value. 47% only provided that they provide green lending but did not disclose the value, and 21% actually are yet to provide green finance. And private sector bank were well ahead in terms of providing green lending to compared to public sector banks. Basically this for renewable energy financing, asset financing was the main source of finance for providing finance to renewable assets. There were around $7.5 billion investment during 2019 to 21, and mostly were 50% were international financiers, and 42% were Indian private sector, and 8% were Indian public sector. So there you can see the graph that only 1% was provided by public sector banks, That means there are 12 public sector banks in India, and market capitalization is about more than 7 trillion rupees. So, sorry to disappoint you, sir. Public sector banks are lagging behind in investment. And since during this time, the RBI repo rate was very low, for about 4% for 2 years. So the lending rates have definitely benefited for the growth of India's RE sector during this period. And similarly, green bonds have also reached a new height in 2021 across various green type of projects. So definitely we would need a lot of finance for lending in RE or achieving the targets in terms of low cost international finance. These are the few risks and barriers which I have listed which will be useful for banks to scale up the domestic finance. Like, the first challenge is about non-availability of debt due to NPA rules. Banks are required to classify loans as NPAs if the payment delays exceed 90 days. So basically, this leads automatically deterioration of borrowers' credit ratings, since overdue payments by discoms. To avoid this, independent power producers are forced to infuse their own additional equity and delay the capital expenditure and use high cost short-term loans. So this adds to challenging for these IPPs to raise debt from the market. So the next debt financing is also constrained by RBI's sectoral lending limits. So for example, the power sector is considered as a single sector wherein loans to renewables, power transmission, power distribution, then grid operators and other developers are considered as a whole. So that is a challenge for us to understand how much money is flowing towards renewables. Separating out renewables as a separate sector will allow banks to lend more towards renewable energy. And I think that currently there are during last couple of years there are plenty of renewable financing is happening, but it's very difficult to track. So also simultaneously there are lending towards deployment of coal power projects as well as power distribution companies. So seriously we require to separate these sectors so that how much money is flowing where we should understand. The next is the RBI guidelines on partial credit guarantee for corporate bonds. So the rule says that there is a cap of 20% for a bank for a bond issue size. So it creates a lot of complexity between multiple banks for a single issue. So if a single bank can give more than 20%, that the flow of money will be much more. Next is the priority sector lending limits and exclusion of other sectors. So RBI sets a lending target for domestic as well as foreign commercial banks in India for priority sectors. Renewable is one of the priority sector. So the current norm is around 30 crores for a project, 30 crores for each bank. So that is very, that amount would finance only 10 megawatt of solar power project. So that should be at least 10 times more, so that more financing will happen for large projects on a priority basis. And also the competition between banks to meet the priority sector goals could result in more favorable loan terms to the developers. Then limited availability of long-term loans, since as you all know, the life cycle of renewable energy is around about 20 to 25 years, but the banks only provide loans for 15 years. So that the other next year, for the rest of the years, the developers search for funding, or they might be funding through green bonds and all. Lastly, there is a high cost of external enhancement products like guarantees and insurance for developers to raise funding. So basically, during this, bonds have become a common choice for refinancing of renewables in India. So the such external enhancement products like first loss guarantee by a third party and insurance to protect the default of counterparty improves the credit worthiness of bond uh, and also lowers the yields. So so to reduce this cost, basically in 2019, Government of India, the budget had proposed to create a credit enhancement guarantee corporation, which has not been set up yet. So now the some of the de-risking mechanisms and scaling, how we can scale up the international finance through banks. First one is green equity approach. I think CFA has done a very good report on that. How a bank can have a source, uh, an international source of finance. IFC had, acquired an equity in Federal Bank, wherein green, basically the green equity approach is to reduce the exposure of fossil fuel and increase the climate lending. Uh, the bank also had consulted IFC to have an internal risk mitigation mechanism so that it can reduce its fossil fuel lending. Next is MDBs. MDBs can also help raise international finance through commercial banks, like the MDB credit line, because the MDB has a mandate for development over profit making. So this mandate allows them to provide lending in a concessional rates, and or also they can provide grants, and this lending can be an effective way of promoting commercial banks, because the local banks uh, are entities which has a specialized team and to appraise and monitor the projects. For example, in 2017, World Bank has lent 625 million to SBI for rooftop PV project. Secondly, it is important for banks to engage with MDBs to create risk sharing facilities and partial credit guarantees. These are the risk mitigation mechanisms to avoid future financial risk for banks. Then blended finance, basically banks can provide a large working capital blended with MDBs, philanthropies, and government to reduce the risk of commercial banks. Then dedicated green bank also helps in mobilize private capital with limited public finance. Then there is also green government loan guarantee, which allows to access low cost capital for projects. And public sector banks can also increase lending by providing concessional loans. So these are the few other developments which I wanted to highlight. Banks are currently facing pressure to improve the ESG ratings, and more banks are divesting away from coal or mining projects. Mostly all banks have a strong counterparty risk assessment framework, and some international banks have completely stopped lending to new projects, contracting directly with DISCOM due to the counterparty risk. And international lenders see India as an important market for growth and diversification in renewable sector. Then one of the key takeaways at COP27 was there will be a possible change coming to the multilateral lenders, to tweak the mandates of MDBs and international financial institutions to ensure that greater financial flows will be in climate mitigation adaptation. Recently, India Ministry of Finance had published India's sovereign green bond framework, which is a welcome step. Currently, India has present G20 presidency and finance track work stream of on finance, sustainable finance, wherein RBI will have to come up with a strong strategy in climate risk and sustainable finance is need of the hour. Finally, conclusions. Public sector banks need to scale up green finance and offer concessional loans to so that they also come forward with the private banks. Then RBI needs to rely for project contracting with discounts in order to maintain borrowers' credit ratings and avoid high cost borrowings. Separate lending category for renewables and increase usage of credit enhancement projects by relaxing rules. Then raise PSL limit for renewables and include other sectors like green, hydrogen, battery storage and EVs. Banks must engage MDBs and IFIs to scale up international finance.